Welcome to week 12. Next week is Thanksgiving, so this week's post will be due in 2 weeks on November 29th by midnight, though you can always turn it in earlier, and yes, this is our last discussion board post. For Thanksgiving break, we will have no new course material for week 13, although I'll upload a folder reading 13, and it will have a short video inviting students to sign up for another office hour the week of November 19th, and will also inform you of the following week's readings. I also wanted to announce that the assignment guidelines for the qualitative and quantitative research article critiques have been posted to Blackboard. I encourage you to look at these worksheets and schedule an office hour with me if you have any questions. The qualitative critique is due November 29th, and quantitative critique is due November 6th, both by midnight. All right, so this week's materials focuses on conducting culturally competent research. According to Rubin and Babby, cultural competence means being aware of and appropriately responding to the ways in which cultural factors and cultural differences influence what we investigate, how we investigate, and how we interpret our findings. Importantly, studies that do not have adequate representation for minority populations in their samples are not generalizable. This is why, for your article critiques, I want you to be aware of who comprises the sample in your selected study and what kinds of generalizations or conclusions researchers are drawing about various populations. You can't draw conclusions about Asian Americans if you only have a sample size of 1 or 2, and you certainly can't suggest the promise of any intervention with this population or any other racial minority group without adequate representation. There are socially just ways for researchers to study minority populations, and it starts with being aware of ethnocentrism, which is the belief in the superiority of your own culture. So learn about the culture that you're interested in researching, and don't just rely on someone from that group to be your guide. Don't assume that all people within that culture or people in general are the same. One way to combat this misconception is to respectfully ask impacted populations what matter to them. It could be that as the researcher, you are studying a question that is not important to that culture or people, or perhaps the construct that you're measuring is not being accurately studied. Regarding recruitment, it's ideal to hire local community members to work on this study. For example, in community-based participatory research, which is a qualitative methodological approach, community members are recruited to be part of the research team and are involved from the beginning of the study. Together, they create the research question, study design, are in the field collecting data, and are then trained to participate in data analysis. Lastly, they also play a huge part in disseminating research findings into the community. In order to retain participants, be sure that there is adequate compensation and any other factors such as childcare or transportation are taken into account when deciding on a setting to collect data. Bilingual research staff are especially important if conducting any sort of interview or survey creation for populations that speak a different language. Surveys should be translated and translation validity should be assessed to make sure that the construct is being conveyed correctly. When interpreting findings, be sure to comprehensively look at ecological factors that may influence results. Too often, researchers focus on the weaknesses of a minority group and do not report on the strengths or the measures that participants scored high on. And so I wanted to switch gears a bit and talk a little bit about my research and what culturally responsive techniques may look like. So first, my research team and I are gearing up to present, depending on when you watch this video, at the Council on Social Work Education's annual conference on November 9th. Our team is comprised of all Asian American women who are interested in studying our demographic, and thus we are able to use our experiences to inform what we perceive as important research questions. And so our study was driven by a few factors. So we wanted to study microaggressions and the cumulative impact that it has on Asian American behavioral health. And two, there was a public call from Michael Liu, editor of the New York Times, encouraging Asian Americans to tweet their experiences of being Asian American in the US. He wrote an open letter to a woman who told him, "Go back to China," and hashtagged it, #this is 2016, and soon everybody else did. So I encourage those of you on Twitter to check out the hashtag. It's full of a lot of mockery and contempt. The video on this slide is only 7 minutes. So next we decided on a sampling time frame and wanted to study the overlap between the 2016 presidential election to see if there were any differences between the types of tweets we were getting before, during, and after the election. Our personal hypothesis was that we were going to see an uptick in experiences of racism and discrimination immediately following the election. As you can see, we coded many, many tweets. And we are actually still coding tweets. But we did have some preliminary results to present at this conference. And these results are essentially themes that have emerged from the data. So folks tweeted experiences related to the invalidation of intra-ethnic differences among Asians, experiences related to the model minority myth, experiences of prejudice, experiences of being seen as other or not from this country, experiences of verbal harassment and verbal violence, and experiences where they've witnessed racism. The number one type of tweet we read were tweets about microaggressions. And so for those of you who don't know, microaggressions are brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults that potentially have harmful or unpleasant psychological impact on the target person or group. And so this, microaggressions, we already had a hunch would be the most common type of tweet, and it was. And here are some examples of what we coded as microaggressions. Because of the qualitative nature of the study and the intimacy and actions, and the intimacy that implications and actions have on our lives as Asian Americans, we engaged in reflexive processes through memoing our experiences of reading these tweets and debriefing as a research team. We found that we were hitting a saturation point with tweets, and the last 100 or so that we coded, we began to see what we once coded as microaggressions, we were now coding as verbal harassment, because we were feeling personally assaulted from reading these words. Another finding that we plan to discuss, actually, please see some of these other discussion items we plan on presenting. I'm just trying to be conscious of the time of the lecture. So moving on, so next week, let's see, remember there's no new readings, and this week's discussion post is due November 29th, the same day that the qualitative research critique is due. Please also remember that if you're in Group C for EBP Part 2, your presentation is due November 15th and should be submitted on the discussion board Group C thread and on the assignment tab. So have a wonderful Thanksgiving break, and hopefully I'll see some of you during office hours the week of November 19th.